Well, hello there. I'm Sheldon. I've got Kirk with me, and we have Jon Topping with us this week. Welcome, Jon. Welcome, Kirk. How are you guys doing? Kirk, you start, Kirk.
Okay, well, I
You're
think
closer.
I'm doing well. They're forecasting a snowstorm later today, so I got up before the crack of dawn, and I had to go cut up a load of wood and haul it here back home before the storm set in. So I feel well flexed out. Lots of exercise, and the snow's starting to come now. I think visibility is 600 yards,
That's getting tight.
and I've only had one cup of coffee today so far. So if I nod off, just yell or something.
Well, at least you'll be able to have a few more before you have to go out and start shoveling.
I'll wait till the snowstorm's over before I do that.
Oh, we don't do that in Manitoba because we'd never get finished. How are you doing, Jon?
Yeah, I'm doing all right. Got the kids in swim lessons now, so we got that going on tonight. Take them swimming, and got a bunch of my pepper plants are flowering and fruiting now in my basement. So got
That was
fresh
going to be my
peppers in the
next
middle
question. How's the greenhouse?
Yeah, good. It's technically not a greenhouse because it's in my basement.
I don't do it technicalities here.
Yeah.
It's you're growing veggies and peppers and stuff in your home. So your home's a greenhouse now.
Yep, they're doing good. Got jalapenos coming in every day. Got shishitos coming in. Lots of good stuff.
What's the most powerful pepper this year?
This year I'm doing Trinidad Scorpion, a certain type of ghost pepper, and then the Armageddon again. So I'm doing 3 super hots this year rather than just one.
Nice.
Armageddon, that's a great name for a hot pepper.
I know. And it tastes really good. It's actually a really, really yummy pepper too.
So it doesn't just like blow out your blood vessels and stuff. It actually has some taste to it.
No, I make it most of it I make into a spice, and you put a little bit of that in the soup, and the soup just tastes amazing.
Oh,
it's hot, but it tastes amazing.
I love that. Yeah. My wife cans a concoction of peppers from last year. She did habanero on down, and I call them, there's 7 jars. I call them the 7 jars of the apocalypse.
Need to get the Armageddon in the mix of that.
Yeah, we need Armageddon. You can't have an apocalypse without Armageddon.
There you go. Well, I found a dealer for you, Kirk. I don't know how
I already got Jon. John's connected me with his dealer.
Okay, good.
I got that, and Patty's actually ordering seeds. Although I'm dismayed to see how far behind we are. John's flowering already.
Yeah,
Patty said last week she needs to order the seeds. So
if they're going outdoors, you won't want to start until at least the end of February.
Okay, that's good. I don't feel so bad then. Yeah, no, they are going outdoors.
Unless they're super hot, then the end of January, so they get that extra month.
Okay, so before we get going, Jon, you've been here before, but I'm sure we'll have viewers that didn't see that episode. So why don't you give a little bit of an introduction to yourself? Why are you here? What gives you the right to talk? I have no right to talk, but you're an expert
don't
in
need
some stuff. What's the background for you and stuff like that?
Yeah, sure. I've been doing apologetics for something like 15 years now. I've been getting paid to do it for about 8 years now. I teach at Master's College and Seminary. I teach apologetics, philosophy, ethics, and world religions. I have a college diploma in video, and then undergrad degree, double major, philosophy and religious studies, and then a graduate degree from Biola in the Masters of the Philosophy of Religion and Ethics. And I also work for Power to Change with you guys. And I run the Ultimate Questions podcast. It's focused on apologetics with specifically right now on the resurrection. And then I also work for Engage International, which is a new apologetics ministry. So the reason I'm here is to chat about the different theories relating to how secular people will explain the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And one of the big ones today is that maybe everybody was hallucinating. And so that's why everybody says they saw Jesus Christ raised from the dead. And why they were so passionate about this is that they were either just hallucinating due to grief or depression or fear or excitement or whatever, or they were on drugs. And one of the big ones being that maybe Christianity was a mushroom cult.
All right. Well, before we get into that, I just want to say if you're watching this either now or in the archives later, please give us a comment. Let us know. Let us know what you think, what your questions are. We'll get back to you. And potentially, if you ask a question now, we'll deal with it at the end of this episode. The other thing is hit the like button, subscribe, hit the bell to be notified when we are doing another one. We'll be skipping next week, but we'll be back in a couple weeks with, I believe, Michael Horner for another episode, which will be good. So, all right. Was Christianity a drug cult? So when the talking points came to me, I'm like, well, was it? That's a great question. I never thought about that before because I literally never thought about this before. But then I realized other people are actually talking about this and actually believing it. So let's just go right into it. John, why is this actually a question that's come up now?
People like 100 or so, 200 years ago, started trying to explain the historical data that we had surrounding Christianity. Because there's good historical data, whether people like it or not, right? Historians all across the board of all different beliefs admit the historical data. And we have things like people who walked with Jesus dying for the claim that they saw him resurrected from the dead. So people have been trying to explain these, and a whole bunch of other facts we can go into later, but people trying to explain those facts have come up with a whole bunch of different theories. And one of the more modern theories is that maybe they were hallucinating. Now that we've kind of delved further into medical sciences and like psychiatric sort of areas, they start thinking maybe they were hallucinating these appearances of Jesus, and that's how we can explain it. So people have kind of jumped on that because it's a quick fix for the secular solution. If you don't want to believe Jesus rose, how do you explain that? Oh, hallucinations. There, we have a way out. So that's one of the purposes. But then also we see a certain degree of people that are involved in the drug culture, whether it be cannabis, whether it be mushrooms or something, where it seems, now I'm biased in this, right? I'm not a part of drug culture, but it seems like those that are in drug culture try to take their favorite drug and find it wherever they can in history in order to give it some credibility, because drugs are looked down on in society. So if you're in your basement getting high on mushrooms and tripping out, and your family all thinks that you're a lousy drug addict and good for nothing, you try to justify it by seeing it in other cultures and other religions, by famous people, by politicians. And if you can justify it and say, hey, the mushroom has a rich and noble heritage, and did you know Christianity was based on mushrooms? And Jesus himself might have gotten high and hallucinated, and that's why he was the way he was. It opened up his mind to a different reality. So that kind of legitimizes certain aspects of drug culture. And it's funny to me seeing how people try to attach mushrooms onto things. The cannabis crowd tries to make those same things about cannabis. So it's like, well, it just looks like an ad hoc way to justify your own preferences to a certain degree.
I just got a phone call from HR here, and they are happy that you are not part of the drug culture. That's come out officially. They were concerned, they said, but it sounds like it's all good. So, Kirk, did you know about all this?
Yeah, I heard about it. A while back actually, and I checked it out. And I mean, my first word out my mouth is just wow. People will believe anything, but it actually, you might say, had a bit of an academic start to it recently. Well, recently, 1970. There was a British archaeologist, John Marco Allegro, and he wrote a book called The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. Now, unfortunately for him, it was completely not accepted by the academic world. It was seen as, at best, a joke, a hoax. He immediately was ushered, he lost his job as a university professor. Now, the thing is, though, is that we can't just write something off because a professor got kicked out of the university for saying it. So why? What is the problem with this? What is basically there? And then more recently, there's another one who is it? There's a couple. That's Matt. No, not Matt Ketterman. There is a Julie and Jerry Brown who've written a more popular level book on this. Now, here's a quote. Here's a quote from what they say, and I want to. He says, we have no smoking gun evidence of this, but there is a plausible argument that if you interpret these enigmatic statements in the Bible, one could draw the hypothesis that they are about a sacred plant. Now, let's just pause there for a second. First of all, note that he says we have no smoking gun evidence. And this is typical of a lot of these wild stories about early Christianity that, like years ago, a fellow gave my sister a book called, I think it was Holy Blood and Holy Grail or something like this.
Yeah,
And he said, yeah, I read that too. And he says, oh, this will destroy your faith. So I thought, well, I better read this then.
That's a great opener. This will destroy everything you believe in.
Yeah, give it. Like when I hear that, I just got to get my hands on it. So I read it very carefully. And what I was looking for, it was very entertaining, but what I wanted to look for, so what evidence is, where's the evidence? And there was zero evidence.
Yeah.
But this is the thing. Whenever you have no evidence to keep somebody accountable, their imagination can just run wild. And this often happens in history. And we have many examples in history and in recent times of people's letting their imagination run wild because there's no actual evidence on that particular thing. And in the absence of evidence, speculation just is not held accountable. Now, if there's historical evidence, then you have to start reeling in your wild tales and crazy stories. So in this case, I just marvel at some of the leaps that, say, Jerry and Julie Brown made when they're suggesting that in the Last Supper, in the upper room when Jesus broke the bread, that it was actually code for magic mushrooms of some description. Wow, like I think if you're going to critique or come up with an amazing wild story about anything, you had better research the thing you're talking about first. And in this case, it's take a look at what the Bible has to say, the history of the Jewish people, early Christianity, and what that Passover meant. And it was very clearly to be unleavened bread. It's stipulated it had to be bread, no leaven in it, and it was to be drunk with wine. Those were the two aspects of the Passover supper. This is not what magic mushrooms, really? Like what happened to the careful instructions about making sure this is unleavened bread? Secondly, there's a word in the New Testament sometimes translated as sorcery, and it's never spoken of in a positive light. But I just here's what the Bauer BDAG, that's the best lexicon you can get on first century Greek right now. So what is that word? First of all, there's a verse in Revelation 9:21 that says that people who did not turn away from murders, nor their sorceries, nor their immorality, etc., will not have eternal life. So what is that Greek word? It's pharmakon, and it has about 3 different meanings. And one of them used here is a drug used in controlling medium, magic potion, charm, that sort of thing. It can also be a healing remedy. It can be a positive thing, but it's not being spoken of here in positive light. So this idea of using some sort of magic mushrooms or cannabis or whatever to give yourself some sort of spiritual high is strictly spoken against in early Christianity and even before Christianity. So it's not only, it's bad enough if there was no evidence and then making up this story about Christianity's origin being, magic mushrooms. But it's even worse when you realize, oh no, there's some pretty strong beliefs in the Bible and in early Christianity that strictly forbid this sort of thing.
And this isn't something that's like, okay, nobody's heard of these books. I hadn't heard of these books, but this is actually becoming sort of popular to talk about. And when you guys said that, oh yeah, Joe Rogan was talking about what? So I went on YouTube, looked up Joe Rogan, magic mushrooms, and Christianity, and all of a sudden there's a bunch of stuff about it. And so I'm listening to this, I'm going, I don't think you can actually believe this unless you're actually on the mushrooms.
Yeah. And in their defense, Allegro, because you kind of wonder, like, how does something like that take off aside from just bias? But Allegro, who wrote the book on the sacred mushroom and the cross, he was a part of the research team, the original research team for the Dead Sea Scrolls. So this is like a world-class scholar that wrote about this. So some of the controversy around it was the fact that this wasn't just some quack appealing to his own audience. This was a real scholar. And so if you look up different quotes relating to it, it's I don't have the quotes off him, but one of them was something like, I think it was in Time magazine, where they said something like, this is the strangest thing that any real academic has ever written. And so you can understand.
That's since been bypassed by a lot of other stuff, I think. But
yeah,
sure.
yeah, that's true. That's true. But in this sense, people look at what happened to him, how he lost his job, he lost all credibility, and they try to blame it on the Roman Catholic Church by saying, oh, he was doing legitimate scholarly work. He's a real scholar, and he loses his job because he thinks something controversial. So the Roman Catholic Church went after him and caused him to lose his job and all credibility. But I mean, his own publisher apologized for publishing his book. And there is no link to the Roman Catholic Church doing any of this or having any involvement in this. And everybody in his community has written him off as a quack. So part of his argument, because it's still important, even if we think it's crazy, what was his argument and why was it wrong? The problem is, and everybody agrees on this, his book is almost unreadable because of the actual work that he's doing. He's taking words, he's doing wordplay. If you've ever heard a sermon where somebody tries to like really dig deep into one word and you think, I think you're taking too much out of this single word to make a whole sermon out of it, you know? That's what he was doing for the whole book. So he was taking the Greek word Christ, going back to the Hebrew word Messiah, and then trying to link it back to Sumerian words that meant mushroom. And he's saying, see, the word for Christ is actually the word that they would have known meant mushroom back in the day. So his argument is actually that Jesus Christ was a mushroom. Not just that he was on mushrooms, that Jesus was a mushroom, and that this was a way of doing fertility rites and things, that ancient Christians were trying to have more babies than everybody else by using mushrooms in order to help them. And which I know it sounds crazy, but his argument there, he's trying to piece together languages and jump from culture to culture, from language to language, trying to make words mean things that they've never meant. So anybody that studies Sumerian, anybody that studies the Semitic languages will admit there is no link whatsoever between Hebrew and Sumerian. But his whole argument depends on it. And so even like people that study these things say you're playing with words in a way that they don't, it's not warranted. You're not actually doing the right, you're not doing good work in this sense. So they weren't writing him off because the Roman Catholic Church told them to. They're writing him off because he's outside of his field and he's writing about languages that he doesn't know about, connections that are not there, in order to come up with a conclusion that everybody recognizes it's impossible. And when you look at the people, like Kirk was saying, the people that evaluate these things, they're saying there is no link between these things, right? There's no evidence. Even the people that want to believe it. Like I was listening to the guy on the Joe Rogan podcast, Murarescu, and he admits there's no real evidence for this, right? But we're going to try to show it anyways. We're going to try to make it fit, right? The Brown saying like, there's no real evidence for this, but we're going to try to make it fit, right? And so even going back to Allegro's work, like some of these people, like the Jerry and Julie Brown's book, they were inspired by the Da Vinci Code to start doing this sort of stuff. And if you've ever looked into the Da Vinci Code, it claims to be fact, and just any historian will look at it and just laugh, right? So in terms of the actual arguments going forward with this, they fall apart the moment you look at them.
So like you've got people that are trying to come up with a reason to say, well, it wasn't actually resurrection, it's something else. Is it, it trying to create a hoax similar to like Pepe the Frog and stuff like that? Or is this a genuine desire to try and fool people?
I think the mushroom cult aspect is a minor footnote to the actual debate that's going on, right? Like there's people that believe it, and Joe Rogan clearly, like if you see the way he talks about his podcast, he clearly wants it to be true, right? So, but that whole debate is more of a footnote when we get into the real debate about how do we explain the historical evidences surrounding Jesus and what are the types of explanations we can give. So if you look at the type of data that we have surrounding the life of Jesus, secular people will argue about this, but all historians across the board, regardless of their religious influences, all historians admit Jesus Christ was crucified. His disciples had a very strong belief in the resurrection. Whether or not he was resurrected or not, let's set that aside, but the disciples very strongly believed it. The belief in the resurrection goes back very early to the cross. We're talking 1 or 2 years after the cross. There was a large group of people believing the resurrection. James, Jesus's brother, went from being a skeptic and thinking Jesus was nuts to believing his own brother was God. And then Paul went from not only being a skeptic, but a persecutor of the church, where his life was dedicated to destroying Christianity, and he took pride in that. He ends up losing everything and converting to the very faith he was persecuting. And then we have a last point that not all historians agree on, only about 70% of them, but still, I think there's very good reason to believe it, is the fact that the tomb was actually found empty. So if you look at this sort of data and you say, how do we explain all that? As a secular person, as someone who doesn't want to believe the resurrection, how can we explain all that? And one of the things they jump to is, what if it was hallucinations? That would explain things like Jesus can still be crucified and people can be hallucinating. The disciples can strongly believe it. The belief can go back to the time of the cross, right? So if they're hallucinating, that can make sense of at least half the data. And so then they try to look at psychological influences for hallucination, usually not drugs. Usually it's something more like a psychological predisposition towards hallucinations or something like that. And if they can do that, then that allows them to explain half the data. And then they usually try some other method to explain the other half. And then it starts looking like a conspiracy theory because you're adding in so many different things together. But that's the main way that this concept comes up in the debate.
I should throw in one thing here because it's just cruising along the surface of what we're talking about. I have, in our culture today, and I've seen this many times in my own conversations with people tend to believe what they want to believe. Mm-hmm. And facts and data are secondary, or becoming increasingly secondary today in our culture. So if it's still something like this topic, for example, is still something that unfortunately we actually have to deal with and take seriously, simply because of our increasing tendency of people believing whatever it is they want to believe, and facts are completely unnecessary. The other thing I've noticed is that even if you don't particularly want to believe something, but you're ambivalent toward it, if you hear it repeated often enough, there'll be a significant percentage of the population begins to believe it if they hear it repeated often enough. So again, we find ourselves in the predicament of having to respond to this. And the third thing is that it never ceases to amaze me, the percentage of a population that will believe the wildest things. Last night I was just watching some video cuts from a flat Earth conference. Mm-hmm. And I kept thinking, is this a joke? Are they really serious? Like, and they looked like they were serious. So if I were an unscrupulous person, I have personally thought of, hey, I should come up with the wildest kind of new thing, spread it around, and somehow figure out a way to get money from that. And I could retire. Like, I could retire in 5 years, because even if only 5% of the world's population buys and it would be crazy. Like, I think it wouldn't be worth doing unless it was so crazy it would have to be jaw-dropping ridiculous. But I am now sadly at the point in my observation of humanity that jaw-droppingly crazy, you'll get lots of people signing up, thousands, maybe more. So here we are.
Someone already did that with if you ever heard the stat that you eat whatever 6 spiders during your sleep or something, that's a fact that somebody made up for the purpose of showing how easily false information can be disseminated into a population.
Yeah, I read
this is what 4chan's about, right?
Yeah.
The 4chan is all about making up hoaxes and then seeing if the media will buy it and seeing how far it can spread. Yeah. And unfortunately, the media is all too happy to spread it.
And I think that's that thing that Kirk is talking about, how people don't really care about facts. If it confirms their bias, they'll believe it. And then if it gets spread around enough, it just gets believed. I think a really good example of that is the idea that Jesus Christ was a mythological figure, where that just gets said so often on places like Reddit, where any debate that I'm in on these topics, some people will say, oh, well, Jesus Christ, if he actually existed. It's like, no historian in the world is willing to say that, except for one guy, and that's literally his bread and butter, is he's making money off the fact that he's the only PhD with history in the world that is willing to say it. But no, historians do not think that's a legitimate position. But it's been said so many times that people think that that's a real position. Like that film Zeitgeist, where they're putting together this whole elaborate argument that Jesus Christ was a myth. And it sounds so convincing, but when you actually look into the data, it's all garbage. It's completely made up. I remember, I almost fell for that one, and that's what got me into apologetics. Was I actually bothered to look into it, and I was actually angry. I was seriously wanting to know the truth. I seriously wanted to know: is Jesus Christ a myth? I need to know. And I looked into it, and I was actually angry because I saw he's lying. He's just mixing up all the data and lying in order to try to convince people of something. And that's what you see in a lot of these arguments, like the mushroom cult thing as well, where the data itself, when you actually look into it, is a bunch of garbage. I remember hearing one of the arguments they make is that Moses was hallucinating on DMT, and that's why he saw the burning bush. So they say, if you have brush fires, like happened in California and stuff like that, if you have brush fires happening, that can happen in the Middle East. If it was an acacia bush, which is what a lot of people think it might have been that Moses saw burning, if it's an acacia bush, acacia has DMT in it. So if it was burning and Moses was nearby, he could have been hallucinating off the DMT. And you think, hey, scholars already think it's acacia. It could have been burning under natural circumstances anyway. It would have got him high. That makes perfect sense. But then you actually look into it a little bit. You can't just burn acacia and get high off it. The DMT isn't structured that way chemically. You can't just burn an acacia tree and get high. It also has, I believe it's a deadly chemical. I think it's arsenic or something like that. It has in it, where if you were to burn acacia and try to smoke it, you would sooner die than get high, because it's deadly to inhale the fumes. But you say, oh, there's DMT in it, and everybody buys it, and you spread that around enough, and people will believe it.
So this is one of those things I really love about these conversations, is it makes me want to get back into why do I believe what I do. And I know, Kirk, you've been posting a bunch of shorts where you take clips out of these conversations and you'll put it up, and we'll have a bunch of people respond to them. And often it's, well, you watched a minute clip of an hour-long conversation, and you just brought up an argument that we addressed in the conversation. So watch the whole thing. But I also think there's this desire, like you said, where you want to reinforce your biases. You want to reinforce your beliefs. And everybody does that. It's not only this group of people ever wants to do that. Everybody wants to do that. We build our worldviews around that, what we believe, and we want to reinforce our belief structure. But there is this, we also don't want to just believe what we know about our own beliefs. We want to destroy everybody else's beliefs. And if we can destroy their beliefs, it makes my beliefs stronger. And I know this is one of the things that comes up quite a bit. Maraxatech, great comment. I see this all the time. The biggest problem with the resurrection is that it occurs in many myths is in almost identical ways. So, Jonathan.
Oh,
can
please
you
let me
take
comment on
this?
that. Please let me comment on that. Yeah, so this is an excellent example of what I'm talking about. If you say it enough, and what Kirk was saying, if you say it enough, people will believe it. In this example, it happens in many myths. Name the myths, look at the myth itself. For example, one of the myths in the Zeitgeist film, they say, oh, this dead and resurrected for the sins of humanity, buried for 3 days. You know, like that's in countless myths throughout history. If you actually look at the myths that he lists about, I forget, 20 or 30 different myths that it apparently is in. If you look into them, totally different. One of them, the guy, I believe the father gets castrated, the blood falls on the ground and causes an almond tree to grow, and then the mother takes one of the almonds and puts it in her bosom, and then they say, look, it's a virgin birth just like Jesus. It's like, is that anything similar to it? And then you see Horace's case. Horace is one of the big guys that they talk about this. They say, hey, he was crucified, dead for 3 days, and then resurrected. And it's like, first of all, crucifixion didn't exist yet, but they try to say that he was crucified. So they're just lying to you. And then was he resurrected? First of all, they get the stories mixed up between Osiris and Horus. So already they can't keep their facts straight. But even then, the death and resurrection, he becomes the Lord of the underworld. He's not resurrected. And then another guy, they say, oh, he was dead and resurrected. Another one of those myths that has all the qualities of Jesus. And he's having a nap under a tree, gets mistaken for a deer, gets shot, goes to heaven, and never comes back. And it's like, oh, a death and resurrection story. And that's like one of the main ones that they bring up, is saying all these stories all have the same qualities, right? Like this person said, the biggest problem with the resurrection is that it occurs in so many myths. Not one example of that predating Jesus. You don't see it when you actually look at the data, but it gets spread around so much that they'll believe it.
You know, I should pop something in here because it's very apropos. It's the word sophistry. Sophistry, if you look it up, it's there's simple definitions: a plausible but fallacious argumentation. I'm not even sure if plausible has to be in there for sophistry. Sophistry, I've listened to it countless times over the years. You hear a lot of it in university on the wildest things, but sophistry would be like a very, I like to describe it as a entertaining, somewhat smoke and mirrors type usage of language, so that you find yourself accepting a conclusion, but then afterwards, when you think back, how did I arrive at that conclusion? There's no rational sequence of events that lead you to that conclusion. It is an appeal to emotion sometimes. A lot of times they'll use technical language. And in fact, the best proponents of sophistry are, the more highly educated you are, the better you are at sophistry, or the use of bafflegab, which is technical language that will cause people to think you're really onto something here, even if they don't understand that. So sophistry, I think, would be well worth, if a listener wanted to go and do a little bit of research on sophistry and how it's used today in examples. It's really prevalent in our society today, but you have to go back and say, how did we get to the conclusion? What premises led us to there? And you'll always find, often in this case, there are words that are in fact, there's a technical fallacy known as the appeal to unknown or unlikely meanings of words. There's another appeal to artificial restriction of the semantic field of a word. That is, the word means this, but you only use it and define it as if it's this, and so forth. So sophistry is a major part of some of these things that you're talking about.
I know we talked about that a few, maybe a month ago, when we were talking about experts, which experts to believe in when we're talking about what Bibles to read, those kind of things. One example that we see a lot today is if you're ever on Twitter and you see a graph, people will believe the graph just because it's a nice graph. And it's, that totally backs up my opinions. Or, oh no, I'm going to have to reevaluate my whole life because somebody posted a graph that says I'm wrong. And oh man, every every time you just read through the replies, and half the time it's just people just believe it because it's in a graph. It's got to be correct.
There's one other thing I think about Maraxatek's comment there that we didn't really address yet, and that is about it being involved in other legends and so forth. As you rightly pointed out, John, because I've looked into it myself at these myths, and wow, there is just no. To say it was a stretch is a understatement to get these out of here, but it still does not logically follow that therefore Jesus actually rose from the dead, or that Jesus's resurrection is any different. But when we actually look at the resurrection of Jesus, it does occur within an historical context at a particular time with many witnesses and so forth, which is entirely different. Even if we were to grant the myths, which we don't, but even if we granted those myths, there is a world of difference between an actual historical event and maybe things that occurred on a myth. And here's an example. The Titanic sunk in 1912, I think, if I remember this correctly. But a number of years earlier, a book had been published, fiction, about this so-called unsinkable ship called the Titan. And there were remarkable similarities. And you can look this one up. Maybe, Sheldon, you can start Googling the book, The Titan. There's remarkable similarities between this fiction book published several years earlier and the real event. Now, people might say, well, look, the Titanic sank. Yeah, right. There's already a legend out already about this hitting an iceberg and whatever, and sinking, and there were almost people dying and whatever. So obviously the Titanic didn't sink. Well, wait a sec. How does that follow? There's a real historical event, and if there happened to be some sort of fictional account of something similar in the past, it doesn't logically entail anything regarding the real historical event. Did you find anything, Sheldon?
I did. Just one sec. I'll share the screen. And I remember you talking about this before. So it's Morgan Robertson's The Wreck of the Titan.
Yeah, and I think in that book, if I recall correctly, is it was supposed to be unsinkable. It hits an iceberg and sinks in the North Atlantic. Now, predicted, I think that's that somebody's using a little literary liberty there. He was just writing a fictional novel. It's not predicted, but in retrospect, you could say it was a prediction. Yeah, 1898.
Yeah, and like you were saying, even if you grant that there was something beforehand, which we don't, right? You can look into the stories yourself and see that they don't. But even if you grant that, it doesn't stop the historical facts from being historical facts.
And historical facts are key.
Yeah, and we have, like I mentioned before, the different facts that I mentioned about like crucifixion, the early belief, the strong belief, James and Paul both converting, the empty tomb. We have so many references to these things. You can't just dismiss it as myth or legend, right? So then how do we deal with it is the real question. How do we deal with the data? Oh, let me see.
Yeah, the day that's the thing. Does your belief, regardless of whatever it is, and that would include Christianity and the resurrection of Christ, does your belief have any historical evidence to support it? Mm-hmm. That's the key question.
And like he was just saying there, he mentioned something like, it's amazing how broad these statements are, saying that there are. So his statement before was that the resurrection is too similar to other myths. I've named myths about this, that like the Mithras myth that I mentioned, the Horus myth. There's another one where he goes into the temple and doesn't come out. They assume he must have ascended into heaven or something, right? Like I named a few myths for you that deal with that the claim is they have a resurrection story like Jesus, and then I told the story and they don't. Right. So like the almonds and whatnot, being in the bosom, being like a virgin birth. We've looked at specific cases. I've named specific facts that historians agree with. So it's not broad or vague statements trying to come off in rhetoric as if I have some sort of assumption. We're talking about historical facts here. The myths and legends do not look like the resurrection of Jesus. I mentioned a few specifically. And if we look at the data that I just finished mentioning, So he's saying it's a generalization that the entire internet has no knowledge. There's so many
I don't
people
think any
that
of us said that.
Yeah. Well, what I think they're commenting on is the fact that what we're saying is you say it enough and everybody will believe it. And that's very true, right? Regardless, the entire internet has no knowledge. If I can't even count how many people I've talked to that bring up the idea that Jesus could have been a mythological figure. You start asking a question or two about the actual myths. Like if I were to ask Mirexatek, or however you pronounce it, name a myth that has a resurrection in it that predates Jesus, right? Like whenever I bring that up in conversation, they don't, and they can't, because they're just believing what they've been told. The entire internet has no knowledge. I think there's tons of great stuff and tons of great knowledge on the internet. Obviously, we all do, but there's so many.
I just
echo
pulled
chambers.
this up. This is stuff I didn't realize, and
Yeah.
as far as I can see, this is not made up.
Yeah.
I think, well, Marexatek's comment underscores a major challenge today that faces every one of us, and that is, how do we sift through the enormous amount of information online? How do we sift through and determine, at least get a half an idea what's true and what's false? But that's part of what we want to do. That's part of what I want to do. And you start to have to, well, what are the references? What references do we have that go back to the time that of the event that we're talking about? For example, the Christmas
And that's the
myth.
important thing, is actually look into the data.
Yeah, the data. What data is
Sorry.
there?
Yeah.
Yeah, what data is there, and we got to look at that. So I would suggest that the internet has an enormous amount of true knowledge and an enormous amount of false knowledge, and it's not just a nice line. There's an awful lot of 80% truth and 20% falsity in this world, or vice versa, 20% falsity or 80% falsity, 20% truth. This is part of what we do.
More on the falsity side these days on the internet, but
yeah, I don't know.
This is where also conspiracy theories often have a little bit of fact behind them, so that I know that is real, but I didn't know this other stuff that is layered on top of it that is actually the conspiracy not real part.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah, and there's a interesting idea that I've heard. I forget who originally said this, but the idea that a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. So if you look into it just a tiny bit, like you skim the surface, it's like, oh no, the Christianity is a mushroom cult and it's based on all these myths and whatever. It's like you start actually looking into it, right? A little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. You actually look more into it, and you can learn the real truth and find out that you've been deceived. Like, for example, the facts that I mentioned. The idea that Jesus Christ was a real historical figure and was actually crucified. We first of all have the biblical authors, about 6 or 7 different biblical authors that talk about that. We also have other non-biblical sources like Ignatius, the Epistle of Barnabas, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, people that knew the disciples, that talked about the disciples' lives, what they experienced. We also have non-Christian sources in Tacitus, Josephus, Lucian of Samosata, Marabar, Serapion, and the Talmud, all of which reference the crucifixion event. And then we look at the idea that the disciples strongly believed in the resurrection, at the very least. We have lots of cases from people like Clement of Rome, Polycarp, Origen, Eusebius, and then, of course, the biblical authors as well, where they all comment on the fact that the disciples claim to have actually witnessed this and strongly believed it. In fact, Gerd Ludemann is an atheistic New Testament scholar. He is antagonistic to Christianity. And he says, it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. In other words, he says, not only does he admit that the disciples strongly believed it, but he admits there was some kind of an experience that they were having that caused them to believe. And then in terms of dating the resurrection belief right back to the time of the cross. Earlier, I mentioned Richard Carrier, who is the most skeptical historian in the world. He's the only person in the world that has a PhD in history that is willing to say, maybe Jesus didn't exist. And he comments on this idea of the resurrection being an early early belief immediately after the cross, where 1 Corinthians 15 has a creed within it that the early Christians would recite. And it talks about the basis of Christianity, that Jesus Christ died and was resurrected for the sins of humanity, that a bunch of people saw him. And so Carrier comments on this, and he says, the evidence for this creed dating to the very origin of the religion is amply strong, and there is no reasonable basis for claiming otherwise. That is the most skeptical historian in the world saying the belief in the resurrection right back to the time of the cross. So when we actually look at the data, not only was Jesus a real person, but the resurrection was strongly believed and went back very early.
Kirk, did you have something you wanted to jump in on there?
Well, maybe it's just a small point, and that is, as John said, you can often find evidence for just about anything. For example, I was talking to some people who actually believe in a flat earth. I was actually having a conversation with them face to face, and they provided evidence. For example, look at the horizon. It looks flat. That's evidence. Okay. So the fact, one of the things we need to be aware of is that just because some idea might have some evidence, it doesn't mean that it's true. In fact, the thing in science the reason why falsification is so important in science is it's not the evidence that supports your theory, but whether or not it has been falsified, or can you test it to see if you can falsify it. So falsification of a theory means that theory is wrong, and it doesn't matter how much evidence you had to support it. So if there's some way to falsify the idea that we live on a flat earth, then even if they say, look at the horizon, it's flat, you know that piece of evidence is not sufficient to verify what they were saying. The theory itself is falsified. So that goes to all these conspiracy theories that we have today. I had a friend who was very into conspiracy theories, and for each one, there was at least a small little bit of evidence, but then they were falsified by other things that I knew. Of course, that can be turned against. I mean, somebody can raise that. Well, what about Jesus' resurrection from the dead? How well does that stand up? Has it ever been falsified, for example?
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent question, because there are attempts to show that the resurrection is false. And there's a bunch of these different secular explanations. Mm-hmm. And in my podcast, I've been going through each one of those and as much detail as I possibly can, to the point it's almost annoying how much detail I go into. But the one I'm dealing with right now is the idea that it was a hallucination, right? Coming back to our overall topic, can Christianity and the resurrection be shown false? And I think all the secular explanations fall flat very easily. So the idea of explaining the belief in the resurrection being very strong and very early, being based on hallucinations. First of all, I think it's ad hoc, which means you don't have any evidence to think that they were hallucinating. It just saves your theory, right? So you don't want to believe the resurrection. So you come up with a theory. There's no data for it. But if you believe it, it helps you stay a secularist. So we have no reason to think the disciples were hallucinating. But then I also think it doesn't explain all the data. So even if they were hallucinating, why would James, who was a skeptic, who thought his own brother was nuts, why would he hallucinate that Jesus rose from the dead? If anything, he expected not to see Jesus. Why would Paul, who was not just a skeptic, but a persecutor of the church, why would he give up everything in his life to gain absolutely nothing? Right? Why would he hallucinate? People say, oh, maybe he was plagued with guilt or something. We have no reason to think he was plagued with guilt. And even then, not everybody who is guilty has a hallucination, right? I've been guilty a few times in my life, and I've never hallucinated anything over it, right? But then also, the biggest one of all, the hallucination theory doesn't explain the empty tomb. If the tomb had a body in it, and everybody's going around saying, I've seen the risen Jesus, and they're hallucinating, just point out the dead body. If I were the Romans, I'd get the body of Jesus and drag it through the streets behind a horse or something, just to show everybody, like, here's your risen Messiah. They couldn't do that because the tomb was empty. Right.
Well, so my question is, if it's a drug cult, you'd think the Pharisees would know that and would be shooting it down so fast that Christianity wouldn't have had a chance to grow.
Oh, it'd be discredited instantly. Yeah. if it was a drug cult.
Instead of one of them joining it.
And that's why they think that the people that advocate for the drug cult aspect say that it was a hidden drug cult, that they were hiding it in art and allegory and whatnot, rather than being direct about it because they would have been persecuted. But the main focus of secular people arguing against the resurrection isn't that it was drugs. They think they were hallucinating because of excitement or expectation or depression or anxiety or something like that. And there are cases of people hallucinating due to that, due to those sorts of stimulations. But the problem here is we have lots of people all hallucinating the same thing, and they're all coming from different backgrounds. So Peter and Paul were supposed to be guilty and remorseful. Mary was supposed to be distressed and fearful. The other disciples were supposed to have been excited and in expectation. You have them all in different locations, in different situations, with different psychological motivations, and they're all going to hallucinate the exact same thing at the exact same time in some cases, over a period of 40 days, right? And it dramatically changed their lives. Like this just... It doesn't have all the hallmarks of hallucinations at that point.
So the attempts at falsification of this, those attempts really fall apart on their own lack of strength. In other words, now Maraxatek raises a question here with regard to experiences. I mean, so did Jim Jones, or somebody else had an experience. Experiences by themselves are still suspect. I mean, when Carrier it was the other fellow that said some of the disciples had experiences of the risen Lord.
Yeah, Gerd Ludemann.
Yeah, Gerd. No, that's not. I mean, I would say, well, the reason they had the experiences of the risen Lord was because he actually had risen, and that would cause definitely an experience. But an experience by itself, it kind of hangs on nothing unless there's some other external data to verify or to somehow add credibility to that experience. And this is the difference, I think, between some of the cults like Jim Jones and others. Jim Jones happened when I was in university in my undergraduate years, and it was big news, and we all read everything we could, but there was absolutely nothing external to give Jim Jones any credibility at all, as if he spoke from God. In fact, there were a lot of things that actually destroyed his credibility. So what you're naming here, there's a couple of things going on here, I see, John. Number one is that there are experiences, but there's also data, and there's also attempts to falsify the theory that Jesus actually rose from the dead. And these attempts to falsify, which are itemized in with a book, Ancient Evidence of the Resurrection of Jesus, New Historiographical Approach by Mike Licona. He goes in detail through a lot of the different possible theories that are put forward to falsify the idea of falsify an idea. Doesn't falsify, first of all, but at least give you another alternative, another way to go. But those ideas fail badly, according to what you've just pointed out.
Yeah. And I think both of those are very good points, that there's a lot of other data other than the fact that people had experiences. And so in addition to that, too, we're not talking about one person claiming to have had an experience. We're talking about all of Jesus's disciples saw him again. And then we even have Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, which dates to 54 AD, right? That's not that long after Jesus's crucifixion. And in it, he says, there's over 500 people that saw him at one time, and most of them are still alive. In other words, he's saying, you can fact check me. People could have gone and asked around, and people could have said, well, no, it's Jim over there that saw him, and that was it, right? But if you have hundreds of people, that's why Christianity exploded the way it did. You had literally hundreds of people making these claims. So it's not just one person saying, hey, I saw something. It's hundreds of people. And at that point, it becomes corroborative evidence rather than circumstantial. So if you have corroborative evidence of lots of people all seeing the same thing, claiming the same thing, and then, like you said, there's a lot of data outside of experiences. How do you explain that data? Right? And so, and then, like you're saying, when the secularist tries to attack Christianity, all their explanations fall flat. They all can get shot down because they don't deal with the data.
One of the things we like to do is believe the things that we like, that we'd want to believe, and things that we don't like, we tend not to want to believe as well. For
Mhm.
example, the conquest of Canaan that Kotyk mentions here. Most of us, we would never want to be ordering the conquest of Canaan. We don't like that, but it doesn't logically follow that therefore it isn't true.
Mhm.
And I should actually respond at another time. We should actually talk about that. That's a big one. I published a peer-reviewed paper in a philosophy journal showing why God would have to, why God, this is arguing from the atheist premise that if God cannot permit pointless evils, what happens when an entire civilization becomes a gratuitous evil? Like, to allow it to continue would not bring about a better good, but also a greater evil.
That's a
By
response to this question as well,
Yeah.
right?
So by that, atheist, that's the usually starting point when you read philosophy arguments against the existence of God from evil in this world. Well, cannot permit pointless evil, therefore, and we see pointless evil, therefore God doesn't exist. But if you take that premise and say, what happens if an entire culture becomes that level of evil where you can no longer justify allowing it to continue because it'll bring about even greater evil and harm? By the atheist's own premise, God would have to destroy or terminate that culture. Of course,
Yeah.
there's some objections that can be raised. I respond to that, but we've kind of moved away. We should get back to the central thing.
Yeah.
But I think it might be worth a whole episode talking about the conquest of Canaan.
And I find that really interesting, the kind of catch-22 situation the secularist is in. Do you want God to deal with evil, or do you not want him to deal with evil? Like, people often raise, like, why is God allowing so much evil in the world? And then they raise the question, why is God slaughtering people in the Old Testament? Do you want him to deal with it, or do you not want him to deal with it? Right? Because dealing with evil is eliminating the evil. So if you want him to eliminate evil, that involves like slaughtering the evil people. People are sacrificing their babies on the burning hands of Moloch. That is a bad thing. God wants to take that out of the world, so that's no longer a cultural phenomenon. You have to stop the culture. So do you want him to deal with it or not?
One problem here that Kotyk raises is what happens if he's talking about the telephone game and how things might evolve over time. So we've talked about the eyewitnesses to the resurrection, that they wrote down these things. But could it be possible that with repeated translation and whatever, the facts get changed? Now, one thing I'll say about this: the telephone game is designed to accumulate error in it. And there's an interesting, I think it was a YouTube video I watched that talked about the telephone game. But the second thing, though, is that, well, who actually wrote down these eyewitness accounts? Was it somebody like in a telephone game? You get really great results if there's at least a dozen. It goes through a dozen transitions. Was it somebody
one of me who has a really bad memory and can't communicate and all that?
Here's a book I'd recommend: Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. If you want to get a taste for how incredibly rigorous they were in the 1st and 2nd century about these facts about the life of Christ, this would be one. Richard Bauckham, professor at St. Andrews University in Scotland. It's almost like a general anesthetic. It's so pedantic and detailed, but the scholarship, I think the popular world here has no concept as to how rigorous and careful these ancient writers were on getting every detail fact-checked and written down, and even who they would even accept. I mean, if you had to be an eyewitness, if you were somebody who heard something from somebody else, that wasn't good enough. You had to be able to supply first-hand information.
And in terms of the telephone game, that completely breaks down, because the telephone game is designed to be oral testimony. We're not talking oral testimony. We're talking written testimony. So here you have very early documents that even the skeptics, I know the skeptics debate whether or not the books of the Bible are written by their namesake, but even the skeptics admit they were written so early that they could have been written by eyewitnesses. So even if they say it wasn't an eyewitness that wrote it, but it was written in the time frame that it could have been, So why not? Right? But either way, it's written so early. And then we have the creed in 1 Corinthians 15 that I mentioned, dating to a year or two after the cross. This is not an oral tradition that went for decades and gradually developed into mythology or something. This is something like immediately after the events, all the people are believing it and claiming to have seen it for themselves. Hundreds of people. This isn't a game of telephone where it's passing on and passing on and passing on. These are all the original eyewitnesses making the claims during the days that it happened. And we have multiple attestations of that. That's a completely different situation.
I guess when we look at the different theories, and this is where Mike Licona did in his massively thick book, which I also have down here, The Resurrection of Jesus in a Historiographical. Just take a look at that unit, and just take like this is another example of a general mental anesthetic that's extremely pedantic. But what we have to do to be intellectually honest is we have to get not just the theory that Jesus rose from the dead, but all the other ones as well. And this is what Licona does, and get them all on a table. And we do the same thing in philosophy. I've read many philosophy papers where we have competing arguments, and each argument has to be assessed as far as how likely the conclusion is given that argument. So when we take the theory that he physically rose from the dead, and we compare them with about the roughly 6, 7, roughly half a dozen other possible explanations, including hallucination and so forth, there is one theory that fits, and ask how well do these answer the basic facts from that time? How well do they answer the facts? The theory that Christ actually physically rose from the dead actually answers all the facts. These other ones they have serious major issues or gaps where they don't at all respond to the facts, or they contradict the facts.
Yep.
So that doesn't prove, we should make this clear. We cannot prove here in this live stream or in a book, we can't prove that Jesus rose from the dead, nor can most historians prove anything else that happened in history. But we can offer enough evidence and a good enough case that the most rational position then becomes to say, I think the probability that it actually happened is greater than the probability of these other alternate theories.
I would go a little bit further than that, just saying it the probability is greater, because what you're doing is using abductive reasoning. Abductive reasoning says, let's look at all the data, let's come up with all the explanations, let's see how all the explanations fare. Do they account for all the data? Do they commit any fallacies? Do they lead to ridiculous results? Those are the three criteria that you use to evaluate each one of the different possible explanations. Then you say, which one is the best explanation? And like you're saying, all these secular explanations, they don't handle all the data. Usually they commit multiple fallacies, which I go through in my podcast. And then they also, a lot of the times, lead to ridiculous results. Like the hallucination theory. It leads to a ridiculous result because that's not what hallucinations look like when you actually look at the qualities of it. But I would argue when you actually look at the data and you look at all the explanations and evaluate them all, it's not just that the resurrection does a better job. The resurrection is the only one that accounts for all the data, the only one that doesn't commit fallacies, and one of the only ones that doesn't lead to ridiculous results. And so it's not just that it's better than the others, it's the only one that actually works, right? Yep. Which is like, that's intense. So I would say, and this is the way I like to phrase it, to disbelieve the resurrection, you have to resign yourself to the evidence. You have to be irrational. You have to believe the less likely conclusion. So if you say, no, I don't want to believe the resurrection, you are deliberately believing a less likely conclusion, which is irrational. You should follow the evidence where it leads.
Yeah, but faith is still required in the end, because at some point, we use the abductive reasoning that you mentioned there, John. At some point, you might say, well, I think that's the best explanation, but do I want to commit to that or not?
Yeah.
And
that's it requires trust.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's absolutely right. And the example that I like using of that is Doubting Thomas, where all of his friends are telling him, we have all personally seen Jesus. He rose. And Thomas says, nope, I still doubt it. I got to see him for myself. I got to touch him. Yeah. And then Jesus shows up and says, oh, you of little faith. Well, hold on a second. Would it have been a move of blind, irrational faith on his part to believe the resurrection. No, all his friends, he's got a dozen people around him, probably more, all around, because you got the women as well, more than a dozen people around him telling him, we've seen Jesus, he's resurrected. It would actually have been somewhat reasonable of him to believe the resurrection at that point, especially because Jesus had talked about it, had brought it up.
Jesus, it was predicted.
Yeah. Yeah. So in that sense, it would have been reasonable for Thomas to believe, but it would have still been faith. It would have been evidence-based. It would have been logical. It would have been rational, but it still would have been faith because he would have had to put his trust in it. And so Jesus, when he meets him, says, oh, you have little faith, because he didn't take that step. He had good reason to, right? It's not as though it's irrational or illogical or non-evidence-based, but he needed to take that step and actually put his trust in Jesus.
And I really like how Jesus responds. Besides the shot he takes at him, he then offers his hands.
Yeah.
And it wasn't, okay, I was hiding. It was, no, you can feel my hands. You can feel my side. I went through this. I did die. And you, when the person that you're saying you don't believe actually came back, he's already disputed all of Thomas's objections to it at that point.
And it's also interesting in terms of, like you brought up, he says, like, I am here, touch me, right? That also gives further, just to beat a dead horse, that gives further reason to disbelieve in the hallucination theory. Thomas did not expect it. He was not excited about the possibility. He wasn't tripping or anything like that. Everybody's telling them that they've seen it, and he still says, no, I need evidence. And then Jesus shows up, he sees him, he hears him, he touches him publicly with everyone else. That's not the sort of situation you see with hallucinations. Hallucinations are private to yourself. The other people can't be involved in your hallucination. Hallucinations, 3 or 4 sensations all at the time, right? So yeah, I think Thomas's example works really well in both of those aspects.
We have one more comment to address, and then we got to end because we're way over time here. But before we address this, thanks for all your comments. Marex Tech, thanks for bringing this stuff up. It's a great conversation. And so we'll do one more. Those of you who are watching this later, like it, share it with other people. Make sure you leave your comments. And if you have any other questions, if you want to talk to Jon, go to jontopping.com. You want to leave messages for Kirk, go ahead and go to kirkdurston.com or leave a message in the comments and we will respond to those. So you're saying there's evidence for the resurrection from a secular source?
Yep. So the pieces of evidence that I mentioned before, the crucifixion, the strong belief in the resurrection, the very early belief in the resurrection, the fact that James went from skeptic thinking his brother was nuts to converting, the fact that Paul went from persecuting the church to converting, and the fact that the tomb was found empty. These are things that secular historians agree with because of the evidence. Because of all the evidence that we have. So I mentioned Gerd Ludemann admitting these points. I mentioned Richard Carrier admitting these points. People like Bart Ehrman admit these points, right? If you have secular, even antagonistic to Christianity, historians that are antagonistic to Christianity, they will admit these points. I brought up the reasons for the crucifixion. I brought up reasons for the belief and for the early belief. So yeah, from a secular standpoint, these are non-debatable pieces of evidence. The people that are debating these are the militant atheists on Reddit that do not have an educational background in history. The actual academic historians admit all of these points. And that's why we say, like, I'm not going to give you evidence that a secular person just can write off, right? We're not going to, like, there's no point in that. I think we should use evidence that everybody should be able to agree upon. And if the entire field of academia in history agrees with these points, it'd just be an incredible move of arrogance to say, no, I'm smarter than the entire academic field of history. I know better, even though I don't have an education in it. So yeah, from secular sources, everybody agrees with those.
And I think we've just skimmed the surface. I think if we went back and say, now, why do these secular academics believe such and such. And we actually started looking at the historical evidence they're looking at, which would be quite a length, probably more than one live stream. Then it becomes, in my own case, it becomes even more and more credible all the time, more and more impressive. Impressive is a better word. When you actually, it's one thing to skim over it and say, here it is. It's another thing to do a second pass in more rigorous detail. And
Yeah.
that's when it becomes even more impressive than anything we've probably been able to convey here in this live stream.
And just for shameless self-promotion, that's what I do in my podcast, the Ultimate Questions podcast with Jon Topping. That's what I do is I go through all the data. I have one on the crucifixion. I have one on the 1 Corinthians 15 creed to show it goes back to early. I have some on James, some on Paul, where I go through all the evidence to look at all of it and just try to put the nail in the coffin to say, there's good reason to believe these things. The really interesting one is the empty tomb. I think I did 2 or 3 episodes just on the empty tomb because that one's really interesting and we have really good reasons to believe the tomb was found empty, so, like from secular sources as well. So yeah, if you want to look more at the data, check out that. I know it's a lot but if you actually want to look at the data, that's what I do.
All right. Well, thank you, Jon, for stopping by and chatting with us. We'll have you on again, I'm sure.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
It is sort of your job. We just say, no, you have to come.
I had to be here. I would have gotten fired otherwise. Yeah.
So,
A likely story.
Awesome. All right. Well, don't forget to subscribe, like this. It really helps get the word out. And hit the bell.
We should mention we're not here next week.
Oh, yes. No live stream next week, but the week after will be Michael Horner again.
That's right.
Going through Christianity, history of Christianity, and was it a good thing or bad thing? So,
I love how he handled that topic. I'll probably tune in.
So we did the first episode a couple weeks ago, and he'll be back for at least one, probably 2 or 3 more. So,
Yeah.
And then he's got lots of other wisdom that we can pull in for other topics, and who knows, maybe we'll do all 4 of us one time, and we have a few other special guests to bring on later too. Awesome. Talk to you guys later. Have a good one.